Emma Best is making her debut, Conservative London Assembly member. Kelly Beaver is Chief Executive of Ipsos UK and Ireland, she reminds me. And Matthew Lesh is Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. A lot to talk about tonight, not just the week's political events, but if you want to ask us maybe you want to ask us a question about the last hour, what Sir Cliff Richard and Paul Gambaccini and Daniel Jannett were telling me. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. And you can watch us on Global Player and the LBC YouTube channel.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Welcome to you all. Let's start off with a rather interesting text question from Sarah in Cheam, who says a video of a hospital nurse telling patients they have a 13-hour wait for A&E has gone viral. This must be going on all around the country. Will the NHS ever recover? Charlotte Nichols, what's the situation in your constituency?
I think, as with a lot of parts of the country, the backlog that we've seen during COVID isn't just a COVID backlog. We've had waiting lists that have been going up and up and up for the last 10 years. We've had a real crisis of recruitment of doctors and nurses, particularly after the government cut the nurses' bursary. And I think it's something that we're seeing replicated up and down the country. Obviously, COVID's made it miles worse. And I think coming back from that is going to take really concerted effort from the government in terms of the investment in the service, but also in the people that run it in order to get that back down.
Now, the government presumably would respond and say, well, the levy that they brought in, which in the future is going to cover social care, initially for the first 3 years, that will pay for the backlog. And that is quite a substantial amount of money. But this hospital in Harlow, what I'm trying to get at is do you think that's typical of hospitals around the country, or do you think it will be different depending on the region?
I think it's going to be different depending on the region, but ultimately we're seeing waiting lists going up right across the country. I think Harlow's a particularly extreme example, but it's not uncommon to hear of people having to wait 8-10 hours right across the country for treatment that they should be able to get within a 2-hour target.
And do you think that also we have a responsibility here, and that it's called A&E, accident and emergency, and at the moment, certainly friends of mine who work in A&E in 2 different places in the country, they're saying people are coming to A&E when they really shouldn't be. They're not. They haven't been in an accident. It's not an emergency. But the patients will argue, well, yeah, I can't see my GP, so what else do you expect me to do?
And I think that's why things like urgent care centres are so important, because for people that can't get a GP appointment but maybe need to see a doctor quite soon, those sorts of things can bridge the gap between people not being able to get a GP appointment and turning up at A&E. Likewise with things like community pharmacies, getting the NHS sort of waiting list down for A&E is obviously going to take investment in all of those different services in order to be able to pick up people that shouldn't be going to A&E. But ultimately, the people are going there because they're ill, they need medical treatment, and they can't get it anywhere else. And until that's addressed, we're not going to see these queues coming down.
Emma Best.
Well, oddly enough, my son decided he was a bit of a monkey. He's 1 year old, and he tried to climb up the back of the chair 2 weeks ago. He fell over, cracked his head open, and we went to Whipps Cross Hospital, which is close to us, and waited probably about 8 hours. First of all, called 111, and that's another problem actually talking about the waiting is 111 called us back and asked if, for the next steps, and I said, well, he's already had his head glued back together, so it's a bit late for the call now. But someone said to me then, next time that happens, you should go to Harlow Hospital, because the queues are much shorter there. So maybe too many people from my patch have been taking on that advice recently. But I do think that's indicative of what you're probably seeing across the country. We actually did a report on the Assembly about the COVID backlog, particularly for cancer cases. And it's really quite scary, the backlog now that the NHS are dealing with. But I think that plan that we now have from Sajid Javid, talking about the very important element of prevention, which we haven't done enough of in this country for far too many years. That is really key, I think, to stopping some of those A&E cases that you mentioned before, where I think people end up in the wrong place. And if we can get prevention right, talking about family hubs, the local community hubs, localising care, kind of coming away from centrally managed, too much central management within the NHS, and giving power back to trusts and local management, I think that's where we can see the NHS and A&E in a better place in years to come.
What really struck me from that answer is when you said you've got a 1-year son and his head was sort of cracked open and you had to wait 8 hours. I mean, a head injury on a football match would be dealt with immediately.
Yeah, not to sound too dramatic, he is okay. It was a cut across here, and so it was gaping and bleeding. But we managed to stop it bleeding enough for them to let us wait. I'm sure if it had been life-threatening, I'm sure we would have jumped the queue.
Kelly Beaver, in all the research that you do and the polls that you do, I don't know if you've seen any movement in people's attitudes to the NHS given this backlog.
Yeah, so NHS as a concern for the public has actually dropped over the last 5-6 months. So we saw it drop away as the pandemic dropped away. But what we do see beneath the surface of that, when they tell us they're worried about the NHS and public health, they're worried about waiting lists and not just the fact they exist. They're worried about fairness and how you're going to decide, or government are going to decide, and the NHS is going to decide who they treat first and on what basis. And that always comes through when we ask the British public about healthcare, fairness, who do you treat first, why do you treat them first? And I suppose the same scenario comes when you're treating a 1-year-old in A&E.
And what do you think? I mean, this is not really a polling question at all, but government can only do so much. They can put more money in and they can pull a lever. But I think a lot of people think, well, yeah, you can pull a lever, but why does it take so long for things to change?
I think just some of the points that Emma was making earlier about the kind of formal structures that government are putting in place, those things are all right if the public are willing to reach out for formal structures, but often they look for informal support, especially if the issues are emotional or mental health. They look to family and friends as a first port. So I think there's a little bit about raising awareness as well that needs to happen amongst the general public, including why you go to A&E and why you might not go to A&E, and then where you go for other support, because they're not always reaching out for it.
Matthew Lesh.
Look, I think the NHS is fundamentally a broken system, and until we can get down beyond, I think we're going to have a very shallow debate about it. We talk about putting a little bit more money here, improving management techniques was the big announcement from the Health Secretary this week. But it seems like structurally nobody else does a healthcare system quite like the UK in terms of very centralised, top-down, government manages everything. You have very good healthcare systems in Europe, in where I come from in Australia, that deliver much better outcomes for people whilst remaining universal healthcare and having a lot more mixed public-private involvement, having a lot more competition, having a fact of a different style of healthcare system. And until Britain can move on from the idea that the NHS is a uniquely great system and accept that there's a broader debate to be had, I think we're really going to struggle here.
Why do you think it is that people say they love the NHS?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said good about the NHS. You know, I recently had an experience with my close family member. It was a serious emergency. They got seen straight away. It's free. The point that all feels very nice, and you can absolutely have an emotional attraction to it. And the people who work in the NHS, the doctors and nurses, are overstretched. I don't think they're treated that well. They're certainly not, by international standards, paid particularly well. There's a lot of empathy, rightly, for the NHS, and people see it as a grand national achievement. You know, we understand the history of that, but I think that can sometimes get in the way and distract from the reforms that need to be had. And every time somebody suggests some fundamental level reform, you get this rhetoric, you're going to privatize. That's been happening for 50,
well, just
30, 40 years.
On that, let's bring in Simon in Southampton. He's got a question on that subject. Simon, hi, go ahead.
Good evening, guys. So I think that this government is slowly, deliberately destroying the NHS. They obviously can't come out and admit it. They're slowly, deliberately destroying the NHS so that they can move to a privatised model. Am I wrong?
Why do you think they would throw billions more pounds into the NHS if they wanted to destroy it, Simon?
Well, they're not exactly the most competent government, are they? Especially with money. But they've got to do it in a certain way. They can't just come out and admit that they're doing it. If anybody was to question them on it, they'd have to shy away in horror.
What evidence do you have that they're doing this?
Because their whole core belief is privatisation and free market. Then it would then open up an insurance model market, which would then bring in more revenue and create more donors for them. They don't get anything out of it the way it is, and they can't have that, can they? Not this lot.
Do you know what percentage of the NHS is operated by the private sector?
No.
Well, in, I think, 2003, it was 4%. At the end of the Blair government, it was 5%. At the end of the Brown government, it was 6%. And I think it's now 7%. So there is a sort of upward curve, but it's a pretty minimal one. I'm not sure that's evidence of wholesale privatisation. Now, Matthew, from the IEA, presumably you would love to see it privatised.
Look, in the first instance, that fundamental question, I don't think the government has a secret plot to privatise the NHS. And if they did, they'd be the most incompetent government in the universe, since they're putting more money into the system. Boris is wrapping himself in the NHS for quite populist reasons. Just hear him in Question Time today. It's all about putting more money into the NHS, not talking about reform. I don't think this government's particularly free market in any respect. I mean, I'd like to see some reforms. I mean, the idea of privatisation, I think, has been, as you've said, greatly exaggerated. Even spending 7% of the NHS budget contracting out to private providers. I mean, even GPs are technically private providers contracted out by the NHS. I don't think we should have any fundamental issue with that if it ensures delivery of good services to people. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it does work, it does work. But the fundamental issue is how can you ensure that people have greater choice? And that's a real issue in the NHS. Often you don't have the level of choice to go to the kind of provider you want. We're seeing this at the moment. A lot of people are now, in fact, going and spending money privately because they're not getting the kind of care they need from the NHS, including not a lot of families aren't necessarily that rich, but have a certain issue they want solved. I think it's the fact that the NHS isn't delivering for people is probably going to drive people into the private sector, but I don't think that's the intent whatsoever.
Kelly from Ipsos, what's the evidence of your polls on the NHS? Are the British public willing to countenance any wholesale reform? Are they willing to countenance more private sector involvement?
It's a good question. So the British public, as you pointed out, they are very proud of the NHS from a principles basis. When you ask them what makes them most proud about being British, our British institutions, NHS is one of those, the Army is one of those, and the green spaces that we have. But ultimately, they still recognise that it needs reform. And when you ask them that question, they recognise there are challenges and that it would need to adapt. So I don't think the British public are, it's all perfect and rosy. They have that acknowledgement. And look at what the NHS has actually had to deal with over the last 2 years in particular, never mind all of the larger macro changes like ageing populations. So in terms of the Conservative Party trying to destroy it and the government trying to destroy it, I don't believe that is the case. I think there are lots of extenuating pieces that not just our healthcare system, but others like that in the US, which isn't doing brilliantly either, is also struggling with, and it's obviously got a different system altogether.
Charlotte Nichols, obviously you're not going to be in favour of privatising the NHS, or if you were, it'd be quite a headline for this programme and the end of your political career.
And rightly so.
But do you recognise that there is a need for reform, particularly when you look at some of the outcomes where we are consistently in the lower half of the league tables if you compare us with comparable countries in Europe, particularly on cancer treatment? I mean, that's the one that's always quoted. The only one where we're ahead of everybody else is the number of diabetic feet amputations, which, from my point of view as a diabetic, is a good thing. But do we not need to improve? And if we do need to improve, we surely have to reform the system.
I'm in favour of NHS reform, but I think the kind of reform that I'm in favour of, and perhaps some of the other guests on this programme are in favour of, are two very different things. I would like to see health and social care much better integrated, and I think that we need to see reform in order to bring parity between mental and physical health. I think those are the kinds of reforms that we do urgently need to see within the NHS, including much more spending on mental health support, getting social care providers becoming something that becomes a model akin to the NHS, because this kind of fragmented privatised model that we see of social care has meant that in lots of parts of the country where it's not financially viable for a care provider to provide care in more rural areas, you have people in hospital that shouldn't be because they can't get a care package in their home. And even within my own constituency, as I represent a town with a sort of more rural area on the outskirts, the disparity between the care that's available to you if you live in the town centre and if you live in the rural areas is huge. And as that's something that's replicated up and down the country with a real postcode lottery in terms of what care is available to you, that's having a real negative impact on the NHS in terms of the number of beds that are being used that shouldn't be, the number of people that are going into hospital because they're not getting that care in their homes, so they're having things like trips and falls and things that are taking them into hospital, if we were to actually integrate health and social care, if we were to make sure that mental health was treated in the same way as physical health was, I think our country would be, better, healthier, more productive, and ultimately, I think the outcomes for the NHS would be far, far better. That, to me, is how we fix the issue, rather than looking at, what private providers we bring in where and how we do that.
Emma, I'm going to ask you to be really quick on this one.
Okay. I'll have to remove some points then, probably. But I think just to turn back, firstly, the kind of idea that the Conservatives want to destroy the NHS is absurd. You just heard me talk about how I was there 2 weeks ago for my son. The NHS saved my dad's life just in the last couple of years. And like Charlotte said, we may have different ideas on how it runs, but fundamentally wanting to destroy is clearly not true. Those two hospitals that were mentioned by me and the caller, Harlow and Whipps Cross, are both getting billions of pounds in funding for new hospitals. That's not a government looking to destroy the NHS. And when we talk about privatisation, it's very important to focus on the fact that some of those organisations are things like Macmillan, they're getting these contracts. Are they evil? Because there's this fundamental belief sometimes that privatisation within the NHS must be evil. But actually, if you look at those contracts, you look at who's providing them, it's all about getting the best care for patients, because clearly some of the scenarios that we're hearing aren't okay. And that's why we do need reform.
Okay, Emma, thank you very much. We'll take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 or you can text your question to 84850. It's 18 minutes past 8.
LBC Britain. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
21 minutes past 8. With me on the panel are the Labour MP for Warrington North, Charlotte Nichols, Emma Best, the Conservative London Assembly member. Where are you a member for? It should say
London-wide, so
London-wide?
everywhere.
Oh, so you don't actually have an individual
No,
part?
it's from the list, so the whole of London, luckily for me.
Represents the whole of London. That's not bad. 8 million constituents. Was it 10 million now? Kelly Beaver is Chief Executive of Ipsos UK. What happened to the Maury bit?
So we finally dropped the legacy brand, the heritage brand. We're part of Ipsos, which is, I know, look, honestly, I don't...
Nothing to do with me, Gov.
No, it is totally to do with me. But we've been part of Ipsos now since 2005, and it was just time. And most people call us Ipsos anyway for shorthand, so it just makes sense. But you can call me Ipsos Maury if you want.
And Matthew Lesh is from the Institute of Economic Affairs. He's Head of Public Policy there. Right, our next question comes from Jane Aber in Leighton. What would you like to say, Jane Aber? Hello. Are you there? Clearly not. So I've got the text of the question here anyway. It says, if Boris goes, is there really no one in the Conservative Party who could replace him? Emma Best, let's come to you first. Are you a Boris Johnson fan? If you'd been a Member of Parliament, how would you have voted in the confidence vote?
You're probably not going to like this answer because I'm going to get a lot of splinters on my backside. But do you know what?
You're not a Liberal Democrat.
I think it's a really hard question, genuinely, because I look at the positive record we had one of the best vaccine rollouts in the world. I look at the response to Ukraine, which I do think has been fantastic from Boris Johnson. But then before I was an Assembly member, I was only elected last year, I was working in children's services. I saw firsthand the devastation. I saw how we were operating under, very difficult times. We would spend, when we were in the office, how we operated with masks and distancing and the stresses that caused. And, some of the other incidents that happened. I do find it quite hard to come to a decision. I think if I had been in that the House of Commons, on Monday, I would have lent towards voting against, but I wouldn't have done it wielding the axe and, proudly, because I think it's a very difficult decision. And I think we do need stability in the country. And we have had, such a tough period with COVID, now the war in Ukraine, and we do need stability. So I think it's not an easy decision.
The question is who could replace him. I mean, obviously, he's still there, and though 41% of MPs did vote against him, he shows no sign of standing down. But if he did, is there one person that you think, that's the person that I think ought to be the next Prime Minister?
I think there's a number of people that would make a great Prime Minister. I don't think now is probably the time to pick them out because it's not the time for a new leader.
You've only been in the London Assembly for a year and you've learned how to give a politician's answer.
I've fortunately been in politics a little bit.
Kelly, I'm not necessarily asking you, I don't think Jane Aber would expect you to necessarily give a preference, but in terms of how things have changed over the last year, I mean, obviously Rishi Sunak was seen as the natural successor. Could you think he could come back into the lists?
I think we saw him drop quite substantively, and that is now, he is not one of the runners and riders from the British public's perspective at this point in time. To be honest, the British public don't really have one, is the truth. If you go out to the average member of the British public, they'll only be able to name about 6 politicians at best, so they don't know all of the different choices that are available. And when you ask them to rate them, there's not really any coming out heads and tails above the others. They have a bit of higher recognition for Sajid Javid, for example. Ben Wallace doesn't do terribly either when you put the name to the public vote and you ask whether you think they would have great prime ministerial attributes.
Because I suppose it depends on whether you ask people for a name or whether you present them with a list of names.
And we do. We present people even with a list of names, but they have the option to say they don't know them. And that's part of the challenge, not just for many of the other Conservative MPs in the Cabinet. It's also for Keir Starmer himself, where there's still a proportion there, a sizable enough proportion of the British public who wouldn't have an opinion. And so people do have an opinion on Boris Johnson. Unfortunately for him at this point, it's not particularly favourable.
Charlotte Nichols, I'm sure you have a very favourable opinion of the Prime Minister, but if he were, I mean, are you a Labour supporter who thinks, no, keep him in post because I think we can win an election against him, or do you think, no, get rid of him because whoever comes next won't have the charisma, the name recognition that he has?
I think in terms of a very sort of narrow partisan political interest, it is in the Labour Party's interest that Boris Johnson remains Prime Minister because of how unpopular he is at the moment. But ultimately, the national interest is what's much more important. And I think it is in the national interest that he goes. I think, Emma's right when she said about needing stability. And that's what we fundamentally don't have from this government at the moment, because they're actually not focused on a lot of the biggest issues of the day, because everyone's just running around sort of trying to save the career of the Prime Minister. And I don't think that's something that's sustainable. It's difficult to see that there are many MPs who could be worse than him within the Conservative ranks at the moment. But obviously, if we're talking about who should be Prime Minister next, you won't be surprised to hear me say Keir Starmer.
I didn't see much evidence on his performance at PMQs today that he was going to be the next Prime Minister. I thought it was a pathetic performance in a way, given he had an open goal to score in.
But I think there's a danger that if he had played too hard on the confidence vote on Monday, that he could have ended up uniting the sort of Conservative benches against him. Ultimately, we're there to talk about the issues that are facing the country. We were talking about the crisis in healthcare today. That's something that's much more important than the kind of internal squabbles within the Conservative Party, which, I don't think that regardless of Monday's result, that Boris Johnson's going to be around too much longer.
Are you telling me you were sitting there thinking, he's doing well today? Because I don't think many other people thought that.
I was sitting there thinking that.
Were you?
Pardon?
Seriously?
To be honest, I was more distracted by some of the sort of very juvenile behaviour from the Tory backbenchers opposite. It was a pretty rowdy and unpleasant chamber to be in today. There was a lot of silly behaviour going on. I think most of my primary school constituents could behave much better than what was on display today. But I think in those circumstances, trying to talk about actual serious issues that affect the country, that Keir Starmer was right to strike the tone that he did.
Okay. Matthew Lesh.
Look, I think on the question, are there alternatives? I think there are a lot of alternatives. And from people like Ben Wallace to Penny Mordaunt to Michael Gove probably fancies himself for another shot at it. Obviously, Liz Truss, who's talked about quite a lot. I mean, all these people could have the makings of a great leader. But the question has to come down to what is the purpose of the change? Because if it's purely just Boris is unpopular, and you elect and you say we moved because he's unpopular, I don't think that's going to cut it. They need someone who can come in with a set of principles and something they want to achieve, and that's what I think Boris seems to lack. He seems to lack a purpose, and that's why, to some extent, beyond his general issues as a leader, the fact that he's not really doing much means there's not a good reason for anyone to support him anymore. He was originally there with the purpose. He went in to get Brexit done, to defeat Jeremy Corbyn, and now he ticked those boxes. Feel like we're lost. So whoever comes next, I think, needs to fix that problem. Otherwise, you're just going to be back in the exact same situation.
And do you have a preference for who might succeed him?
I mean, I'm not persuaded yet by anyone in particular. I think it's a pretty open field.
So 4 panellists and not a single name that any of you have come up with?
You said Anna Firth was nice about me beforehand. So,
She was, but I think saying Anna should be the next leader when she's only been in Parliament for 3 months, I think might be pushing it a little bit much. Now we've got a question on polling next, which I don't think we've ever had one on polling before. So Kelly will be ready to answer that one, and we will take more of your calls. If you have a question for our panel, we've got half an hour to go. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. It's 8:30, and Lottie Morley has the news headlines.
A former Foreign Office advisor has been forced out of her job after calling Boris Johnson a liability. Baroness Morrissey, who's also a Conservative peer, said the Prime Minister has shown no contrition after surviving a vote of no confidence. Sir Cliff Richard has told LBC he didn't sleep properly for years after being accused of child sexual assault. The singer, who was never arrested or charged, wants the law to be changed so suspects have anonymity unless they're charged. And former film producer Harvey Weinstein is being charged with 2 counts of indecent assault in London. The CPS says the allegations, which relate to one woman, date back to 1996. LBC weather, dry for most areas tonight and a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:34 on LBC. Charlotte Nichols, Emma Best, Kelly Beaver and Matthew Lesh here with me answering your questions. Let's go to Christopher in St Albans. Hello, Christopher.
It's actually St Athan, which is a long way from St Albans.
Why did I say St Albans? It doesn't even look like St Albans, does it? Where is St Athan then?
St Athan's in just outside Cardiff in South Wales, home of Aston Martin, actually. But my question to the panel is this. Can YouGov polls be now trusted following the revelations that in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn's lead in polls was suppressed?
Kelly Beaver from Ipsos, we have to come to you on this. Can you take your Ipsos hat off for a second and can you just explain to everyone what the story is here?
Yes, so I was watching it very avidly this morning unfold on Twitter, Christopher. So there is there's a political polling world that exists full of political pollsters who all work for various organisations, and one of them works for a new organisation now but used to work for YouGov, and he was tweeting about the incident that happened during that 2017 election period where he had and his team had produced some political polling, and he alleges that they were not allowed to publish that polling because of both political pressure and also the pressure from his own senior management because of what the story was telling. And as you say, because the story was saying that Jeremy Corbyn's support looked higher than perhaps in some of the other polls. They were testing a new methodology. It was an MRP poll as opposed to some of the more linear polls that are done by other polling firms. And so they took the decision not to publish it. The thing that was, and it had an impact on how others responded to this, though, was the fact that it was a decision that was taken because of the story it was telling, was how the tweet was written, and that wouldn't be considered practice or how the political polling industry has to be independent and has to retain that independence at all costs in the way we ask the questions, the way we publish the results, the transparency of what we do. And so that is why it ended up causing quite a furore on Twitter. Retweets, I think, reached into the thousands. And we've had a statement subsequently from YouGov themselves on their perspective on what had happened, and also Nadeem Zahawi also did a Twitter post on it today as well.
Because he used to be the chairman of YouGov, didn't he?
That's right. I think he established it with...
established it. In fact, I was a shareholder in it right at the beginning, but I sold my shares too early.
But he is not today involved. He's a minister in government, and so this was going back... It's going back quite some time since he was last involved with YouGov.
So Chris Curtis is the pollster concerned who used to work from YouGov, now works for Opinium. He's slightly backtracked now, hasn't he?
Well, I think Chris probably didn't... he underestimated the impact of what he said and probably the severity of it as well, and that is now coming to the fore. It seems Twitter has calmed down a little bit since I left the office this evening, and I'm sure Chris and many others might hope that this fades a little, but it is quite a challenging thing to go back from.
But if you were Stephen Shakespeare tonight, the MD of YouGov, you would be pretty furious, I imagine. I mean, do you think this could go a little bit further, or do you think that both parties will want to just sort of brush it under the carpet now?
So I couldn't comment because I'm not Mr. Shakespeare, so I won't comment on that. I'm very proud of the work we do, the independence that we uphold in our polls, and this kind of incident is not one I would ever expect.
Emma?
I would only say, not being an expert in the polling field and operations of the methods used, but I would say that if the question being, can you trust a YouGov survey? And, well, if you've been a Conservative member over the last few weeks or months, you're not going to think there's any bias towards our party there. So I think you certainly can trust YouGov polls. They're fair to me, and we've certainly taken a kicking in some of them. So doesn't suggest to me there's a massive bias.
And it's an international organisation now, isn't it? I mean, if there was, I mean, it would be incredibly damaging to their reputation. So it's not even in their interest to do it. But Matthew Lesh, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think this is very, very difficult for YouGov. There was, thinking back to what the facts of the case, there was a lot of genuine concern around the 2017 election, because it was a sense that Labor was doing very well, much better than people were expecting, particularly after Theresa May made her, I'm not doing a U-turn, nothing has changed comment. And there was a lot of commentary around the pollsters and then subsequent commentary around the YouGov MRP. It ended up actually being that YouGov was pretty accurate in the facts of the case on the polls they released. And they were one of the few pollsters who did actually call the election pretty accurately. So I don't think you can make a strong case that YouGov has done terribly here. It's hard to judge the internal dynamics of what happened between Chris and his colleagues this particular moment in time. If it does for some reason end up in court, we might see some fascinating internal documents and see how the sausage is made in the world of polling, and I'm sure it will be quite interesting and fascinating to us political geeks out there. But I'm not sure the implications are that much broader than that.
Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a pretty incendiary allegation that's been made. I can't comment on the sort of veracity or otherwise of it, but, polls ultimately tell a picture of a snapshot in time. We've all watched how they've moved about all over the place over the last couple of years. I'm not convinced that even if the poll had been published, that it would have made a particular difference to the outcome of the election. And, I'm not sure how useful some of the commentary on it today is. We should be focused on sort of building for a Labour government going forward, rather than sort of dredging up why things might or might not have gone the way that we would hope in the past.
OK, thank you very much, Christopher, for your question. Now, a text question here from Barney in Manchester. Is Cineworld right to pull a film just because there are a few protests? Now, this is about the film The Lady of Heaven, which Cineworld, the movie theatre chain, they have pulled this entire film because of protests that have been held outside various cinemas, Bolton, I think Sheffield and Bradford as well. And it apparently depicts the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. So some people are regarding it as blasphemous, but we don't have a blasphemy law in this country. Is it right, I mean, just to add to the question, is it right for a cinema chain to effectively censor a film? Not just censoring it, they're now banning it. Emma?
Cineworld are, they're operating in a free market economy, and if they, as a private company, wish to not show a film, they are within their rights to do that. Should films be cancelled? That's another question. And I think the question comes down to culture and art, and the purpose of culture and art is to challenge and in many times cause controversy. Now, the problem with that is when it's not done well, it's just offensive. But then the other problem with that is whether something is done well or not is clearly subjective. So that's the problem, isn't it? But I think we can't censor because that we can't make that challenge on whether something should be in the eye or not. But Cineworld are well within their rights not to show the film, but the film's still available. And just say I do get why it is so sensitive. I believe it's not just the daughter, but the actual Prophet Muhammad is depicted, which is clearly a massive issue, to many in the Muslim community. And I can see why it has caused such an outrage. But something shouldn't be cancelled, but it is Cineworld's decision to show it or not.
Well, the executive producer of the film, Malik Schlibach, says the protesters were behaving like thugs and bullies, rushing into cinemas and intimidating staff. Charlotte Nichols, you can understand from an individual cinema manager's point of view, if you've got these protests, the easy way out is say, OK, well, we won't show it. But it sets an unfortunate trend, doesn't it, or precedent?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cinema managers have ultimately got a duty of care towards their staff that are working there, to other cinema goers, and if they've taken the decision in terms of protecting the safety of cinema goers and the staff that work there in order to not show it, I think that's probably the correct decision. As Emma said, getting into wider conversations around, things like blasphemy, what's offensive and so on, that's a much broader conversation. But, they are a private company. They have the right to show or not show whatever they deem fit. And I don't think it's for politicians like me to sort of demand that something's shown that they don't want to screen.
Shouldn't politicians like you be in favour of freedom of expression?
Yes, but ultimately, as I said, it's not my place to tell a private cinema company what they are or aren't screening. If it's up to me, I think most cinemas would be showing very different things than what they do currently. But it's not me that makes that decision.
But if this cinema decided to show a film portraying Holocaust denial, or maybe a double X-rated film, you would have a view on that?
I mean, I would certainly have a view on a film portraying Holocaust denial, because that's something that I don't think that the BBFC would allow to be screened in cinemas in the first place.
But my point is that you're tiptoeing around this issue, like a lot of people do, because it is related to Islam and Muslims, and I think people feel that they can't really I'm not saying you're not expressing your real view here, but there is a tendency to possibly not say as much direct as you would on those other subjects. Do you see what I mean?
I think it's because I'm not aware of the specifics of the film itself or why it's caused the controversy it has. Obviously, the way sometimes that things are reported and the actual sensitivities can be two different things. So I kind of don't want to go in two-footed on something that I'm not aware of the specifics of. But as I said, it's some of the examples that you raised. They wouldn't be allowed to be shown in cinemas by the BBFC. And on that basis, if one of my local cinemas was showing banned films, I think I would take exception to that.
Well, we are going to be talking about this in the 9 o'clock hour, and I'd really like to hear from Muslims in that hour as to what your view is on this, because I suspect there is not a universal view on this, that a lot of people will say, well, this is actually about freedom of expression. I'm not offended by a film like this, but let's see. We've got the BBC Religious Affairs editor, Ali Makdol. He said this: unlike some incidents in the past, opposition to the film is not primarily about how the way the Prophet Muhammad is depicted, though there is a CGI portrayal of him in it. Criticism mainly centres around the way the Shia Muslim filmmaker and cleric Yasser al-Habib has portrayed prominent revered figures in early Sunni Islam, implying that there are comparisons between their actions with those of the Islamic State group in Iraq. Complicated issue, Matthew.
Look, it is complicated, but I actually think the principle here is quite simple. I think it's pretty disgusting that a mob has succeeded in managing to get a film taken out of the cinemas. The justification used by the protesters was this is blasphemous, it's insulting, it's offensive. Well, living in a free society means accepting sometimes people are going to say things you don't like, accepting that you don't have a right to silence others. And unfortunately, it's obviously worse if the state's forcing that upon people. But even when a mob succeeds in imagining to make a private company censor its own affairs, I don't think that's a particularly good cultural moment. And what really worries me here is that a lot of the rhetoric you're hearing here is actually very similar to the kind of rhetoric you hear around council culture or what kind of movements that say, well, that's so offensive, I can't hear that, you can't say that. Now, we're now using that same rhetoric to justify what is, in a sense, a modern form of blasphemy. And we've also got all sorts of new laws coming from the government that aren't being talked about very much, in particular the online safety bill, that will give legitimacy to people who are taking emotional distress from things and be able to require, or at least be able to push for things to be taken down. And it really worries me, this censorious direction we're moving in. I'm
trying to imagine if The Life of Brian were released now as a new film, which was blasphemous. Some Christians would certainly say, whether Cineworld would take the same attitude to that. Kelly?
Well, I don't know, because I haven't actually watched Life of Brian. Don't judge me.
It's not very funny,
Don't judge me.
think.
I don't think it probably is either, otherwise I would have seen it. On this topic, I'm not that aware either of the issue, but I've been listening and I read briefly just in the break a little bit more about it. And what I would say is, there's a danger in listening to the loudest voices as well on these things, and what Cineworld probably haven't done is some proper research to understand how offensive this is to the broad population. Their job is to find movies that have a high demand in their Cineworld complexes. And
they presumably thought that this one would,
well, they
otherwise
must
they wouldn't
have
have showed
thought,
it.
they must have made a decision at some point to show it, and now they are hearing from a group who don't believe it's worth showing, and so they've made that decision, and that is totally their legitimate right as a private organisation.
More questions to our panel in just a moment. It's 8:48.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
50,000 RMT workers plan midsummer misery, as it's being called. The biggest wave of strikes since 1989. Josh in Notting Hill.
We need to get people around the table.
That's
Where
right.
are the train operating companies on here so you can criticise them as much as the poor people who are working on the train?
They're making more than £1,000 a week to drive a train.
Just think about yourself and your
I
driver.
make sure that your train
Don't worry
runs.
about people like me.
I'm trying to ensure your train runs from Notting Hill to St Albans.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8 minutes to 9 on LBC. Charlotte Nichols, Emma Best, Kelly Beaver and Matthew Lesh are with me. Jim in Christchurch is our next caller. Hello, Jim.
Hello, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
My question is, 1 in 4 people estimated to have mental illness, lots of them with clinical depression. My wife suffered with depression for 20 years, and a few years ago her psychiatrist advised her not to watch soap programmes. I'm just wondering if the team think, because he thought they were detrimental to her health, and I was going to ask, do you think a health programme should be put on the TV soaps before the programme's shown?
That's a really interesting question, because we do get all sorts of warnings before programmes now. I'm a Coronation Street addict, and there was a storyline recently, which I'm now trying to remember what it was, but I remember thinking to myself, if I had a mental health problem here, I'm not sure I'd want to be watching this. Charlotte?
I think it's something that we're increasingly seeing on a lot of the on-demand and streaming things. You'll notice sometimes that in the top corner of the screen, as you start to play something, it will sort of say, something about, that there's certain language or, scenes of sexual violence and things like that you get a little bit of a forewarning, and people can obviously then make an educated decision on whether or not they want to view what's about to start. Obviously, you see it at the beginning of films. I think that things that are live broadcast on TV, I don't see any reason why something like that couldn't be in the top corner of the screen again, so that viewers knew at the start of the programme whether it's something they wanted to watch or not and make that decision for themselves.
Kelly.
So mental health issues, not just the prevalence that you mentioned, Jim, but people's general awareness of mental health has really gone up over the last couple of years. We see it coming through maternal mental health, children at school and their mental health. It's coming through quite prevalently in newspaper stories as well as on the news generally. I'm not adverse to the idea of having something on programmes which identifies what kind of content would be there and what kind of trigger warnings it could have for people. But ultimately having that is also a bit of a trigger warning, so there's a bit of a balance to be struck there, and I'm sure some helpful research wouldn't go amiss.
Are you touting for business?
Not at all. The truth is, Iain, we don't need to, but...
I love it.
But I think there's definitely something in this, and this is we've done quite a bit of work for organisations like Ofcom in the past, looking at sort of language on broadcast media and how that impacts on people and the prevalence of it. And I think this is a really interesting area, and it is coming to the fore more and more in people's consciousness. So I think it's a really clever question from Jim. And
I must admit, I host quite a few phone-ins related to mental health, and I'm always conscious that anything I say could have a real effect on somebody that's listening, particularly in those hours. Emma?
Yeah, and Jim, thank you for sharing that, and I hope your wife is well today and perhaps got some support beyond the suggestion to not watch the television. But I think it's an interesting point, and like I say, we often have the trigger warning at the end. I don't watch soaps so much myself, but when my mother-in-law comes to stay, that is all that's on the telly, and I've noticed that they do always seem to have that warning at the end. And I mean, a lot of what you were just saying there about treating health, how bringing mental health to the forefront, is about treating it with the same parity as physical health. And we would often have warnings before shows about, flashing images and things like that. And so perhaps it is something to consider in the same way. I know a lot of shows already do. They say, there'll be scenes of a sexual nature and explicit language. You could easily have the same warning about, the sort of subjects that may come out. So it's certainly something I think should be considered with research as well, because sometimes if we act too quickly, again, we could make it worse if instead we're triggering people unnecessarily. So it would have to be finely balanced, but I think it's certainly something to look at.
Well, Matthew Lesh, is all this a bit nanny state-ish?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. There's been an ongoing debate about trigger warnings, particularly at universities in recent years. There is some interesting academic research to suggest that they can be counterproductive, particularly if they, not only is the trigger itself potentially triggering two people, but you're kind of encouraging or suggesting a certain reaction. If you say, and there've been trigger warnings put on classical books, and there's questions around that. But if you say this is going to be deeply offensive, or this is going to be racist, or this is going to be traumatizing in some way, you're basically encouraging people, almost telling people to have that reaction to the material. On top of that, there's all these questions around what is the best way to, if you have a mental illness, should you basically turn off the television? Should you lock yourself away, or do you need to kind of slowly, obviously with proper support through the kind of CBT type methodology, actually challenge yourself and look at material that might be distressing in the first instance. So trigger warnings just kind of make people more brittle and less capable of dealing with bad material. They're not necessarily going to work that well.
I suppose the thing is, where do you end this? Because you could have, for example, something before an episode of Line of Duty saying, we'd like to tell you that not all police officers are corrupt and act like this. I mean, I can understand the logic for what Jim is saying, but sometimes you think, well, I was watching something the other day, and there were 3 of these warnings beforehand, and it kind of almost made me not want to watch it. it was going to be like that. But anyway, let's move on to our final text question from Katie in Plymouth, who says, Sir David Attenborough has received another royal honour at Windsor. Surely he's got enough of them now. Who else deserves a knighthood or a damehood? Matthew.
You, Ian, I'd start there.
Joe, I knew you were going to say that.
The easiest,
damehood.
Whatever you like, whatever the Queen or decides is due to you. I mean, who does deserve a knighthood? I mean, I find the whole idea of knighthood's quite just intellectually fascinating. It's like we kind of, as children, we play, kings and queens, and then as adults, if you do well enough, you actually do get to you get knighted. God. I mean, there was that whole debate around knighting, Tony Blair. Actually, I was for knighting Tony Blair on the basis that, he's a substantial public figure. So I think that's kind of my criteria in a sense. If you're, contributed well to public debate, you've made a great contribution in some way, I'm happy to see you knighted. I can't think of anyone in particular off the top of my head.
Well, Mark Littlewood, your boss, will be very disappointed in you. Charlotte.
He can be put in the Lords maybe and then knighted later.
Charlotte.
Do you know what? I'm someone that I've always found the honours system a little bit strange.
So does everyone until they get one.
But I remember a few years ago, Mary Turner, who was the president of the trade union GMB, sadly passed away, and she'd actually received an honour, which meant that, as someone that had been a dinner lady for her whole career and was, a union rep, that she had her funeral in Westminster Abbey. And, because you have the right to do that after you've had...
damehood.
Damehood or some of the honours, things like MBEs give you the right to do that.
So you can get married in St Paul's if you've got an OBE, I think.
Yeah, and what that meant actually for her friends, her colleagues, her family, in order to see her achievements recognised in that way. I would like to see, rather than giving it to celebrities, many more normal people who do, the kind of jobs that Mary did, who do that sort of service to their community, many more of them getting honours.
Do you want to nominate a normal person?
I mean, I represent a sort of around 100,000 constituents. I don't think it would be fair of me to single out any one particular person.
Well, you get a headline in your local paper.
But, I think we have, many, many people locally who deserve that kind of recognition.
Kelly.
So I got an honour in the list.
Did you?
So I love them. I think they're a fabulous idea. It was an MBE, so it was not a knighthood or a damehood, and it was for services towards COVID. We did a huge effort as Ipsos, and I was very pleased to receive it. However, if I was picking somebody, I think actually some of the teachers, there were lots of NHS staff who received honours and others who were involved in helping with the research and the response for COVID. But I think some of the teaching staff who were heavily involved as well could really, as you say, some I am a normal person, some other normal people, because it makes such a difference.
Well, you know what OBE stands for, don't you?
No.
Other buggers' efforts. Emma.
Yeah, well, I have to admit, for being quite a royalist, I didn't realise you could get double knighted until today. So, I don't think we need to really be double knighting too many more people. I think there's enough.
But if anyone deserves it, I guess
Charlotte would say, I would focus on people in the community. I think that's wonderful when people that are not in the spotlight receive these honours and get to feel, respected and as though their work has meant something.
Well, I'm not sure that Katie has received the answers that she was expecting. I think she would accuse you all of virtue signalling, but there we are.
I did have some of my local primary school students recently say that we should have posthumous honours because they wanted to give
what's the point of that?
To I think his name was Willard Tull. So Bruce Primary School, maybe that's what we need, posthumous honours as well. Can recognise people from history that didn't get the recognition they deserved
that's a very dangerous road to start down. Charlotte, Emma, Kelly and Matthew, thank you very much for joining us. In a moment, we're going to return to the subject of one of our questions, the fact that the Cineworld chain have cancelled a film called The Lady of Heaven after protests outside various cinemas in the North and the Midlands. I want to get your views on why that is, particularly if you are a Muslim. I want to understand why this sort of film is so offensive to you and why you think it should be banned. And we don't have blasphemy laws in this country, should we? 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. A Tory peer and prominent Brexiteer has been forced out of government after calling for Boris Johnson to resign on LBC. Baroness